Welcome back to Contextual Electronics. My name is Chris Gamble, and this is Getting to Blinky 5.0, where we're actually doing the layout for the blinking board. Now, what you are probably going to notice real quickly here is that for this board, which is pretty simple, it's actually a bit anticlimactic to hook things together. If you're doing everything right, doing layout is extremely anticlimactic. It's basically putting parts in the right place and then kind of just running traces. Now, it can definitely get more complicated. I do contract electronics design, and every day, as you start to have more and more parts in a design, the complexity goes up, kind of scales almost by the square, right? So basically, you start to have traces run into one another. But in simple boards, if you're like I said, if you're doing things right, if you're having things hooked together right, if you have things set up correctly, it's actually pretty trivial to get things hooked together in the layout. So let's take a look at what we're talking about here. So this is where we started last time, right? We're got our battery footprint that we made. Remember, we looked at all the components there. We have our resistors and capacitors and diodes and our 555 timer, 7555. So we have all of these things in here. All right, so now what do we want to do? Well, we want to make a board outline. And if you remember in the last video, and actually I could just show you again here, this is the board outline that was generated for us. This is different than what we actually want to have. This is just calculated, basically saying, hey, what are the extents of this board? What we want to do is we actually want to define our own board outline. So let's do that here. We're going to start, let's start on the edge cuts layer. So you can do that one of two ways. You can select it here on the right by just clicking. You see that little arrows there. So we're just going to select that layer. You could also do that up here. And now what we're going to do is just draw a square, and that's going to define the outside of our board. I'm going to change my grid. Usually whenever I'm doing a board outline, I start in a large grid size. Well, probably 5.0 is 5 millimeters too big for us here. I'm going to start with 1 millimeter. And that just makes it so that it's a nice, large board layout. I'm going to do it about 25 millimeters. That's about 1 square inch. Actually, I guess we're going to just do it to the outline of this part here. So we could probably even just follow along on this courtyard that we did here. Normally I do 1 square inch because we use services like OshPark or similar, and that's very cheap to do that kind of thing. So this is 29 millimeters. Let's just make it 30. Let's see, is that 30 across too? 33 across. All right, well, let's do 30 by 30. How about that? We'll undo this. So we'll start here. I'm going to hit the space bar to remember setting 0, 0 down here. So we'll go down to 30. Okay. And we don't need to draw it around this part. I'm just doing it because that feels kind of like that's actually what's going to define us here. Is 30 going to be enough? Oh, 30 is not enough. Okay, well, we're doing 30 by 32. Yeah, there we go. So 30 by 32. That's our board size. And we'll get back up to 0. There we go. All right, and that should finish us there. All right, so now we can move this thing around. So this is going to be the battery holder here. I'm actually going to flip it to the back side. There we go. And now what you see is these little white lines that are connecting all these things together. That is what's called rat's nest. And if we want to turn that on or off, we can do that up here. We can see rat's nest. We can turn that on or off here. Sometimes it gets a little bit complicated to look at what's going on there. You can do that there, and then you can also do that over here. So there's this hide boards rat's nest as well. It's basically just doing the same thing. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to just place our components. I'm going to put the 7555 right in the middle, smack dab over top of that pad there. And then let's start placing the other components around it. So I'm going to select one of the components, move it around here. Now what I usually do is I start to just kind of drag things around, right? I could also go and see what the connections are, and I'll probably split screen here in a second. But you see as I drag things around, you see, okay, hey, look, this is hooked to pin 1 and pin 2 of this part. So now I'll usually start hitting R and doing something like that so that I can say, okay, that looks like 2 straight lines, nothing's intersecting there. You see everything in the middle here. We're basically trying to get rid of these intersections, which is going to make layout a lot harder. So we're going to select this part now too. You can also click and hold to drag stuff around, but like I said, I usually am mousing over, hitting M. Sometimes that you end up grabbing other things there, but usually if you mouse over a pad, it'll grab the entire part. All right, same thing here. We're going to pin 3. All right. At pin 3, that looks like that's the output. How about the LED? That would be the other part that's hooked to the output. That looks right. Okay. So now we see it's hooked from the bottom of R3 to pad 2 of D1. Okay, and then we've got these guys over here. Oh, sorry, I was going to show you that other method. So let's do that. Let's put this in split screen here. So I'm going to turn off some things. You see that when I go split screen, it starts to get kind of crowded over here. So what I'm going to do is actually just turn off the layers and then turn off the microwave toolbar, which we really aren't going to use. That's definitely an advanced topic there. And the reason I like doing this is because say I wanted to say I know I wanted to place a new component here, I can go and select it. Select it here, and that actually, it cross-references and selects it over here. I think when I'm switching screens for some reason, it's showing that no connect. I'm not sure why it's doing it. I'll have to check into that. But if I hit escape and then select one of the components, you can see I can go and select the individual components, and it grabs focus over here. Like I said, when you start to do more complicated layouts, that can be really, really useful. Now, again, with another complicated thing, if I'm just looking at the schematic and say there's like 100 components on here, sometimes I might not even be able to pick it out in a crowd of other components. So what I might want to do is click over in the layout, hit T, and then type in which reference I want to do. I hit R1, it's going to grab that and say, okay, we're ready to place this. Where do you want to put it? And now I know I'm going to hook into pin 7. I could see that on the schematic there. So I know I'm going to be hooking into pin 7 and pin 8, it looks like. Well, in this case, pin 8 is also power. So what is pin 8? Pin 8 is also power, right? Okay, so, and you know, another thing we could do here, and this actually might make things a little bit easier, is let's go and label our nets, right? So I'm going to go back to my schematic. We can also show the updating of the schematic to the layout. Sometimes this is nice to go and label my nets. So I'm going to do VDD, which is just power. So I'm going to label that net. Ground is already be labeled. I can even label, say, you know, so even though it's hooked into the pin that says discharge or dis, I might want to label that net as well, just to make things a little bit clearer. Sometimes you want to do that, right? And then here, I might want to do threshold, right? So I can go and label these nets, and now it should show up over here. So what I'm going to do is hit save, and then I should be able to hit F8. And now is going to update. You see it's adding nets. That's what it's doing here. I hit update PCB, watch over here. And now everything's labeled, and things get a little bit clearer. That's kind of nice to do. All right, so let's move that last component. That's going to be T to grab the component, R2. Now I'm going to rotate this guy around. And there we go. So now we see, the nice thing about this, you don't have to, like I said, you don't have to label your nets. It just sometimes makes things a little bit clearer. It can be a little bit, and I will also caution you, if you label too many nets and you start hooking them together, it's going to just grab one of the multiple labels you have there. So do be careful about that. I've had some contextual electronics students who do that, and they get very confused about it. But like I said, if you just have simple things here, you might want to label a net to just make things a little bit clearer. And you'll definitely see when things aren't hooked up properly then. Otherwise, what you see is you see things like, oh, you can't see what I'm looking at here. You see it just kind of assigns a generic net here, which is just net 5, U1, pad 5. And actually, this one is not hooked up, as we talked about in the earlier videos. All right, so we've got all of our parts in place. And like I said, this is kind of, we're now at the part where this has made things much, much easier, right? Everything is basically saying, hey, here's your guidelines. Just go and hook things together now. So now there's two ways you can do this. You can do it from the sidebar here, which is basically you want to draw a track. You can do that here. You can also do it by saying route single tracks, or what I usually end up doing is I hit X, and that actually starts the routing tool as well. So that's actually my favorite one to do. Okay, so let's go and start routing some traces here. Now, another thing to note, and I guess something we haven't talked about yet, is there's a bunch of default line widths here. So you see our default line width is 0.25 millimeters, and then our default vias are 0.8 by 0.4 millimeters, or 31.5 by 15.7 mils. Right, so it gives you both things there. If we want to, we can go and change all this stuff here. We can do that in the board setup dialog. Now this is basically, to run through this real quick, we are doing a two-layer board, meaning there's a top and bottom. There's no inner layers, like ground and power. We're going to leave all this stuff default. We're going to go to the design rules, and we see our minimum track width is 0.2 millimeters. Basically, if you want it to be in mils, oftentimes if you look at a lot of the board houses, they list things in mils. So if you want to switch over to mils, you can. You do that here. Go back into here. You see all of our stuff is already set up in, it was started in millimeters, so it's going to give these weird fractional things here. But many board houses say our minimum is 6 mils, and both for space, or the trace width and the space between them. And so in this case, that's fine. Our minimum is going to be 7.87. I'm going to leave this stuff as default here, because it should be the default what you have grabbed as well. And same thing now here, net classes, this is also the clearance, so this is the space that I talked about is 7.87, and then track width is above 6, so that's okay as well. So this should all be fine. So the defaults should work in KiCad for any of the online low-cost bundling services, what we'll talk about in the next video. And then we could add additional track widths here. We're not going to do that. And then finally, you don't need to touch this either. So all of these things should be good. We'll take a look once we get to the in the next video where we do manufacturing. If we need to change anything, we'll do that there. So like I said, I'm going to switch back to millimeters. I actually do work primarily in millimeters these days for track and for everything really, especially the board dimensions. I really, really like doing that. Non-fractional, non-imperial units. So first thing we're going to do is hit X to start, and we're going to start drawing here. Now what you see is we can actually draw. It's got this large break here, and it's like, oh, why can't I move this stuff? It's actually because I changed the grid width. So I'm going to actually move this down to a smaller grid width now, 0.1 millimeters. And what you should see is it looks much more fluid now. I actually have many more options about where this bend is going to happen. Click once to change. See, I'm just kind of creating these joints here. I'm going to undo all that. So I'm just Control-Zing through all that. I'm going to hit X to start again. And then I'm going to finish here. It should actually snap to the pin, the center of your pad there. And now we've done our first one. What we'll see is that we have a list of unrouted signals down here. This says 13 unrouted. If I do this one, you should see it go down to 12. So now it's 12. Okay. We'll hook these together. And the nice thing is it's kind of like a game. You just kind of start to knock down the number of pads that are not hooked together. Now what you see here is that kind of jumped up. It's kind of doing this weird thing here. Now I'm going to just draw it. You see, and now it's kind of like an ugly, I don't really like how that looked. But what I can do is I'm still in the drawing mode. You see I'm in track routing mode. If I mouse over and hit D, or I right click and I hit D, what I'm going to do is drag. And we can drag and reposition all this stuff so it looks a little bit nicer. I can do the same thing out here. Oh, you see I'm actually unconnecting it there. But then I can start X to draw. And there we go to finish. Okay, great. So let's continue to hook up here. Okay, click, click, click. Got that one done. Got that one done. How are we doing? We got 8 unrouted left. All right. We're going to hook up VDD. We're going to leave that VDD. And now we have ground. Oh, okay. So now we've got ground. What does this mean for us? Well, what this means is that we're going to have, you see there's a bunch of the unrouted signals are all pointing to that center pad there, right, which is the ground pad. And what we want to do is we want to have everything hook into that, but we don't want to actually have to draw all the traces. So what we're going to do is actually we're going to draw what's called a ground pour, right? Or sorry, a copper pour, which is going to fill in copper everywhere that there's not a trace. So first thing we do is click on the filled zones. We're going to actually we're going to do it at the same outline of our board here. So I'm actually going to change my grid again to be 1 millimeter. And I'm going to start by clicking there. I'm actually going to go to the bottom layer so that the copper is going to be poured on the back side. And then I'm going to say ground. So that's the net that we're actually going to be connecting it to. I'm going to hit OK. And then I'm going to just trace outside of the board outline here. It doesn't have to be outside the board outline. It's going to cut it off wherever the board outline is. So that's something to keep in mind. And what we see now, let's turn off all the front side pads. So we'll turn off the front side footprints, we'll turn off the front side copper. And now we're just looking at what the back side of the board is. It's actually the reverse view. If you wanted to see the actual view of what it looks like, it's actually the same, so it's not a huge deal. So what we see though is that the center pad is connected into all this other copper by these connections here. These other 2 pads, the VDD pads, are not hooked in because it does not it's not the same net, right? So it needs to be the exact same net name for it to actually try and hook these things together. So what it's doing is keeping all of this green, which is hooking into the center, all of this is going to be at the same voltage or the same potential as the center pad. And then these 2 pads are separate from that. They're going to be kept separate in the copper as well. So let's turn our front and back copper back on. All right, so now what we can do is that now if we want to hook a pad, so this now, it says, hey, hook this pad 1 up to this center pad. Instead of hooking it directly there, what we can do now is go to the top layer, right? I'm going to hit X to start drawing. And now you see the whole bottom side is highlighted. And that's saying, hey, you can hook up to anywhere down here. The way we're going to do that is dropping a via. A via is just like a tunnel through the board to the bottom side. I'm going to hit V. You see that draws that circle there, and then click to finish. And then you see it's going to say, oh, well, you could draw a line there. It actually doesn't matter, though, because it's not going to show up. So we can just say, all right, it's hooked anywhere to this green pad. And now what we see is we go back to the top side. Go to the top side. And now it no longer shows that it has that rat's nest, because it says, hey, this bottom of this pad needs to be hooked to ground because it's going to via and then contacting this big pad of copper down here. It's fine. It's doing exactly what we need it to. Let's do the same thing up here. So we're starting on the top layer. Hit V to drop a via. Double click to finish. Hit escape, and we're good to go. So now it's basically saying, hey, you're now on the bottom layer. You could draw stuff down here. That's why it's not showing that top side copper stuff anymore. It's weird. It's not switching back. Oh, I'm on a different computer. So I actually switched the hotkeys on my other computers to be 1, 2, 3, 4 is the top. 1 is the top layer, 4 is the bottom layer. But you see here, this is showing page down as the bottom layer, page up as the top layer. So if you want to, you can use that as your hotkeys. There's other videos showing how to change your hotkeys, but that's why you kept seeing me type 1 on my other computers. I'm used to that switching between layers. You can also, when you're not drawing, you can hit V, and that also changes the layers. It's just changing between the layer pairs that you have there. Even though we're not dropping any vias, the V also will show you what it looks like. So let's do the same thing here. So we're on the top side here. Drop V, drop a via, and we're good to go. Hit V again. You see we're back to the top side. And now we finished all of our ground connections there. That's good to go. Now what we need to do is we actually need to draw a connection from this over to here, right? We see pin 2 and pin 6 should be hooked to the same thing. Now we could do this one of two ways. We could do this where we start drawing here, drop a via, and then go around to over here, and then once again have a via that goes to the top side. The problem with that is that when we hit B, which fills in the zones, we see now that it cut out a huge area of that ground plane. Now that's okay. I'm not a huge fan of that though. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm actually just going to draw around on the top side layer. And I'm actually going to change my grid again because I didn't change back from that larger grid that we were on before. It's a 0.1 grid. Now I'm going to actually draw right over top of that pad. And you might be thinking, wait a second, how are you drawing over top of that pad? Well, that big 1 VDD pad is actually on the bottom side. And that can be kind of confusing when you're getting started. You're saying you don't want to draw over top of other pads there. You're thinking it shouldn't work. But the thing is, it does work there. Now, I'm actually going to show you one other way we can do this now. You see I drew all the way around here. What's another way that we could do this? You might be thinking, wait, how else could we hook through there? We didn't want to hook through that center pad here. We didn't want to drop over top of pin 2 on the bottom side. But what we can do is just that, right? And that connection is valid, right? Even though it looks like it's going over top of pin 2 on the bottom side, that bottom side pad, sometimes what you're going to need to do is turn off the backside copper and pads and just look at this as in an isolated way, right? This is what the top side of the board is going to look like. Let's look at it in 3D now. This is what the pad looks like. This is what it all looks like in 3D. This is totally workable. If we want to go and change what actually shows up here, say we don't want to see any of the 3D models, we just turn off all the 3D models. Okay, and now we see that this is actually what the 3D version of this is all going to look like as well, right? So that's that trace we just drew there. Okay, so now what we do need to do though is we need to hook up pin 8 and pin 4 to VDD. So how could we do that? Well, we could do that one of two ways, right? We could draw these traces and then drop vias like we were talking about, right? We could just draw a trace to here and drop a via. Well, we don't want to drop a via on the pad usually. So we could do something like that. And let's go back up here, right? So that's totally valid, but you see it's still hooking up and saying, hey, you should really hook to all of these pads here. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm actually going to go and copy the bottom side copper layer and change its net name. So let's do that. So I'm going to go and select this outside layer. I'm going to right click. I'm going to say duplicate. I'm going to drop it right over top of the other one, right on the corner there. And now we should have two pads here. And actually, you see now when you click it, it's saying, wait, which one do you mean? There's actually two here. And this is a dialog that pops up often. So we're just going to pick one of them. It doesn't matter which one. We're going to hit E to edit it. We're going to go and select and say, no, you're on the top side now. And say, OK. So So we hit B to redraw the ground planes here. That's fine. But but we don't actually want it to be a ground plane, right? We actually want it to be a power plane, right? So we're going to go and select the top side layer again. We're going to hit E to edit it, and we're going to change its net to VDD. Now if we hit B again, it should redraw everything we just did. And what you see now is that this is kind of hard to see. Let's see. Let's do top side silk. It's kind of easy to see if we do front footprints front now. Well, it's going to be a little bit easier to see maybe in the 3D view. But what we see is that if we hit Control B, that actually undraws it. But remember, VDD, pin 1 and pin 8 here, these wanted to be hooked to this top side as well, to this bottom side VDD. And same thing over here, pin 4 also wanted to be hooked to VDD. So we hit B, and now they're all connected. You see it's connected here, and it's connected here. It's drawing this connection point to these pads. But what you might be saying is, hey, wait a second, there's still 2 unrouted connections. And why is that? That's actually because we haven't taken the backside pads and hooked those to that top side copper. So what we're going to do is just go from the backside pad, drop a via here. Now that's connected. Go back to the bottom side again. Now we're down to 1 unrouted. And now from the VDD, we're going to drop another via. And now we're down to 0 unrouted. Let's see if we can get a little bit easier view of what this looks like here. So now what we see is it's kind of a different color here. Anything that's light green is there's actually copper there. Anything that's dark green, there's no copper there. And so if we look at the back side here, we see some, oh, I left some trace behind. We see all of the, again, the copper on the back side. Now all of this is ground copper. All of this is power copper, right? So these are the 2 things that we know there. And so we're just about done here. Like I said, on the back side, we're going to go back to the back side. We left an extra trace here. I left this behind. We can actually select this, hit I, and that selects the entire trace. We don't want to do that. We're just going to select individual traces. We can either hit delete, or we can hit backspace, and that selects individual sections. So if we go back up to the top side here, now we should be able to hit B to redraw, and we're good to go. So all of our things are routed now. And like I said, in our layout, now we should see that trace is gone. So we've got all of our connections here. What we can kind of see is the bottom pin of D1, and it's kind of hard, like I said, it's kind of hard to visualize vias when you're getting started here. But let's see if we can't do a little bit of movie magic to show it's a little bit easier here. So we're going to turn off the board body. Let's see if that helps a little bit. So like I said, we have a copper trace running to this via. What is a via actually though? It's actually like a copper pipe going between the top side and the bottom side. And for me, that was always really hard to visualize at first. I always had trouble with that. It turned off some of the other views here. But like I said, there's a trace going from D1 to this via, which is kind of it's a drilled hole that then gets plated. And then it looks like this column of copper. And then it basically acts as a wire from the top side to the bottom side. And so that's really useful for going around components, getting things connected in other ways. So there we go. It's a little bit easier to see it hopefully with that. So this is the board that we've made so far. In the next video, what we're going to do is, well, first off, we're going to go and save this. In past versions of KiCad, I told people to save all the time because it crashed so much. It does not crash. The 3D viewer sometimes has a little bit of, the GPU sometimes crunches on things and might fault out. But and I'm very safe, but I think the autosave function and things have just gotten so much better from KiCad 3.0 to 5.0 in general. So in the last video, what we're going to do is we're going to go and we're going to add some text, and we're going to make that thing a little bit prettier and take a nice look at what the board looks like. Once we've done that, we're also going to, this is basically going to be the finishing of the board. So generating Gerber files and uploading it to an online site. We'll also show you a site that doesn't actually require any Gerber files, which is really nice for beginners as well. So hopefully this has been a, like I said, once you're ready to go, you're learning a lot of new concepts here, which is, really tough. And I'm hopefully covering a lot of them. It's a compressed period, right? It's a lot to kind of take in of like putting together the mechanical pieces of of how PCBs are made, what is a PCB even, right? And you know, copper, how does a copper trace kind of relate to all this stuff? Or drawing copper, but not really, and we're flooding copper planes. I know that can be confusing. And one thing I always push is just to get repetition. So this is your first board, but hopefully not your last. And if you want to do more boards, we do a lot of that over at Contextual Electronics. So if you have any questions about all this, you can go over to the forum. That's forum.contextualelectronics.com. You can also ask in the YouTube comments. And yeah, in the last video, we're going to be getting this all buttoned up and sent off to a manufacturer. And then we'll probably do a soldering video as well. That's all for now. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next version of Getting to Blinky.